This man made a huge discovery in a local pond just outside of town. The body of water was previously used for fishing, but had been closed off for some time, and when he went out to take a look, he discovered why. He found this strange, rusted boat floating sideways in it, but what he discovered inside left him instantly speechless. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The finding of this mysterious red boat and all the turmoil that followed it started with a simple tip over the phone. News reporter Bob Oakley was the one who answered. Bob worked for a small newspaper in the area and was usually assigned to smaller cases, and this seemed right up his alley, at least so he thought at first. The local resident calling with the tip mentioned something about a narrow river that had turned red in their town, along with the local flora and fauna dying and decaying around it. The story seemed small, but with no better lead, Bob gave it a shot, not knowing he would stumble upon the biggest scoop of his career. The thing that triggered Bob the most was the tip giver's hushed tone when mentioning a few ponds north of the town, and the words he used when talking about them. If you want answers, look in the old ponds up north. Something is floating there you need to see. Bob instantly felt uneasy when the man said this. The man hung up the phone shortly after that. He did not want to mention his name, and he pleaded with Bob not to discuss this phone call with anyone, nor mention ponds. The man's secrecy was confusing and troubling, but Bob promised to keep quiet. Bob took off about an hour after the call, and the drive up there was instantly stranger than Bob expected. He noticed right away how the world seemed to split in two. On his right-hand side, bright fields were alive with wildflowers and full of color and life in the soft morning light. But on the left, where the creek ran, the view was entirely different. The grass there was dull and dry, and whole patches had turned a sickly gray. He saw weeds that looked slimy and rotten, and as he drove with the window down, a terrible smell filled his car. The stench was thick and chemical, but with something even worse underneath, like the scent of things long dead. When Bob finally saw the creek itself, he had to slow the car. The water was an odd reddish color, with streaks of brown and orange swirling through it. The side of the river stuck with Bob as he pulled into town and parked near a small cafe. The building was old, with faded paint, but there were a few locals sipping coffee outside. Bob gathered his notes and went over, introducing himself and explaining he was there to write a story. The people seemed wary at first, but after a moment, one old man nodded and said, "It started a few weeks after the longest day of the year, right at the end of spring." Another woman joined in. Then the creek started to change. The water became thicker, almost oily, and its color changed strangely. After that, it was hard to ignore. The smell just kept getting worse. We stopped letting our kids play by the banks. Bob listened carefully, scribbling notes as they talked. "And where does the creek originate from?" he asked. Not knowing this question would lead him to a horrible discovery. The old man pointed north. "Way up there, through the hills. It passes through a bunch of ponds that folks used to fish in, before they closed them all off for some reason." The mention of the ponds instantly triggered Bob's memory. It matched what his tip giver had told him. "Sealed off?" he asked. The woman nodded. 5 years now. Some company moved into a facility up there. Nobody knew what the company did, but they'd kept to themselves. No one ever saw cars or people come down. Some locals even believed the site had been abandoned years ago. The mystery only deepened Bob's interest. Bob thanked the locals and promised to keep them informed. As he walked back to his car, he wondered if this was just pollution from an old factory or something far stranger. Before leaving town, he wandered along the sluggish riverbank. The water bubbled and shimmered with an oily film. Dead fish were trapped against rocks. Even the wildlife seemed disturbed. A heron emerged from the reeds, shrieked, and flew off. Bob took photos and water samples before heading for the hills, determined to uncover what was happening up north. After half an hour, the road ended abruptly at a tall wire fence that vanished into the trees. A rusted sign warned, "Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Bob got out and examined it. The secrecy surrounding this place only made him more determined. He could feel the truth waiting just beyond the barrier. The woods were wild and silent. Finally, Bob reached the first pond. Its banks had collapsed inward, clogged with mud and weeds. The water was thick and discolored, reflecting the fading light in dull orange streaks. There was nothing visibly unusual, no movement, no signs of life, but the silence pressed in. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, Bob knew he was already in too deep to turn back. There were several ponds scattered across the hills, all connected by a narrow stream. To trace the source, Bob had to reach the highest one. Following the winding waterway, he pushed through the thick brush, climbing toward the upper slopes. After a steep climb through nettles and tangled branches, Bob reached the last and most hidden pond. Pushing past the bushes, he froze. Half submerged at the edge of the water lay a metallic hull, tilted, rusted, and streaked with the same red color that stained the creek below. It was a boat. Its peeling red paint flaked into the water, perhaps explaining the color of the stream. But something about it didn't feel ordinary. The boat's presence here made no sense. Why would anyone sink a vessel in a closed pond miles from any river? Bob's instincts told him this was the real secret, the reason for the tip, the source of the strange pollution. As he leaned closer, he spotted an opening beneath the waterline, a dark hole yawning under the boat's edge. He hesitated. The red water looked thick, oily, almost alive. Bob stripped down to his underwear, folding his clothes neatly on the bank to keep them dry. He checked his backpack, 2 bottles of clean water. He'd use them to wash off any residue when he was done. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the pond. At the boat's opening, Bob ducked his head but kept his face above water. The air inside the boat was thick and sour, heavy with decay. Bob tried to breathe through his mouth as his flashlight swept across the cramped interior. The walls glistened with moisture and streaks of red. Nothing moved, just silence and the oppressive smell of death. Then his beam froze on something at the far end. 2 barrels slowly surfaced, bumping together in the murky water. Bubbles hissed from beneath them, tinting the pond an even darker shade of red. One barrel turned, revealing a label that made Bob's stomach drop, a black rat silhouette above a skull and crossbones. Rat poison. The barrels were leaking straight into the water, poisoning the pond, the stream, and the town below. Bob snapped several photos, then scrambled out of the boat. He reached the bank, grabbed his bottles of clean water, and poured them over himself, rinsing the chemical film from his skin. Shivering, he searched his phone. Exposure to rodenticide skin contact. The answer brought some relief. Rinsing immediately could prevent serious harm. Why here? Why this hidden pond? And who would contaminate the water that flowed through the entire town? Bob dressed quickly, still trembling, and began taking photos of everything: the barrels, the boat, the glowing red surface. Each image added to a story far darker than he'd imagined. Then, between the trees higher up the hill, he saw it, a sprawling factory-like building, half concealed by pines. Its metal walls shimmered in the afternoon light. The woman in town had mentioned a company that moved here 5 years ago, one no one ever saw again. Bob hiked toward it, camera ready. He crouched behind a rock, taking more photos. Pipes ran into the ground. Trucks sat idling beside loading docks. This was no abandoned facility. It was thriving, and it had to be connected to the poison. A sudden bell rang across the compound. Workers, dozens of them, streamed toward a central door. Within moments, the yard fell silent. Lunch break. Bob seized the chance. Staying low, he slipped between storage tanks and along the concrete wall until he found a side door propped open. Holding his breath, he stepped inside. The stench of chemicals hit him instantly. At the back of the building, he reached a loading dock. There, in perfect alignment, stood dozens of red barrels, the same kind that had surfaced in the pond. Their symbols matched exactly. Bob lifted his camera again, heart racing. He found a source, the connection, and the evidence. The mystery of these sealed ponds, the strange smell, the dying fish, all of it led here. Each barrel bore the same fading warnings, their paint peeling and rusted. Bob photographed everything, documenting every clue before pressing deeper into the factory. Inside a cluttered office, papers were scattered across desks and floors. Folders marked test results and environmental impact caught his eye. Heart pounding, Bob flipped through them, and the truth hit him hard. The poison hadn't been dumped by accident. It was part of a deliberate experiment. Charts showed how toxins moved from pond to river to town, tracking animal deaths, crop failure, and contamination levels. Every creature and person downstream had been reduced to a data point in a corporate study. Another folder contained internal emails about disposal procedures, public image, and controlled exposure zones. Notes stressed secrecy and contingency plans if anyone found out. Bob felt sick. The company wasn't careless, they were calculating. They had poisoned an entire community to study the results. He photographed every page, determined to bring the truth to light. But just as he finished, a bell rang the end of lunch break. Footsteps echoed in the hall. He darted through the side door and crouched low among the trees. The hum of voices grew behind him as workers returned. Bob didn't stop until he was far down the hill, breathing hard, clutching his phone like a lifeline. Back in town, he ran straight to the small police station. mud-streaked and shaking. He handed over his phone and backpack, spilling out his story: the poisoned ponds, the barrels, the factory, the documents. The officers' faces turned grim as they scrolled through his photos: hazard symbols, rat poison barrels, experiment charts, and secret memos. The chief immediately called for reinforcements. Nearby towns were alerted, and environmental authorities were dispatched to the site. Bob gave a full statement, sharing everything he'd found. For the first time, he felt relief. Someone was finally listening. The burden he'd carried alone was now in the hands of justice. Exhausted, he went home and scrubbed himself clean under a hot shower, watching the last traces of red swirl down the drain. That night, surrounded by notes and evidence, he began to write. He detailed the anonymous tip, the sealed ponds, the hidden factory, and the cruel experiment carried out in silence. Every sentence was a promise to expose what others had buried. When his article went live the next morning, it spread fast. Local headlines exploded, then regional, then national. Radio stations and TV anchors repeated his findings. Hidden poison factory discovered in hills. Public outrage grew overnight. Protesters gathered at the factory gates and outside the town hall, demanding accountability. Bob's phone buzzed nonstop with reporters and activists asking for interviews. Within days, police raided the facility. Managers and technicians were arrested, and the plant was shut down. The government charged the company with environmental crimes and human endangerment. Cleanup teams moved in to contain the contamination. Months passed, and the land began to heal. The red water cleared. Fish returned to the creek. Plants slowly regrew. The company's assets were seized to fund restoration and compensate the affected families. Bob Oakley's story became a symbol, a reminder that truth, once uncovered, can force even the most powerful to answer for their actions. The town survived, the river lived again, and justice finally flowed downstream.